Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Perceptive Podcast, where we examine the art and science of games. I'm, of course, Josh Bycer, and we have another developer interview lined up. My guests tonight are the two-person team from Imaginary Friends Games. They just released the adventure game Shindig that we played a little bit on stream, and they're here to talk about their backgrounds as well as designing a game that's definitely meant more for the wholesome audience. So, please welcome Fay and Martyn. How are the two of you doing?
Hey, we're doing fine.
good.
It's a little late over here in the UK.
Yeah.
So we've got coffee. We have
Coffee. We're
cats
hopped
in
up on caffeine.
attendance.
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of international guests. I have a few friends in Australia, and it is definitely a challenge getting time zones and stuff connected that way.
Yeah, I think Martin's more used to working across the globe, in different time
That's
zones
true.
and things like that. But it's always a challenge, really, isn't
Yeah.
it? So
But
we get by.
there we go. But it's great to have the two of you on tonight. I know you were trying to get more people to look at Shindig. I know it's definitely a tough market all around. So I'm happy to have the both of you on, and hopefully we'll have a great discussion about the game tonight.
Awesome. Looking forward to it.
All right. So, since this is both of your first times on, as I always like to start these casts with, could you talk a little bit about your backgrounds in game dev? And for people watching, what is Shindig?
Okay.
Okay, which one should we go with first?
Let's explain what Shindig is.
Yeah, okay.
First, and then this sort of context. Okay, so Shindig it's a funny, feelsy, fully voiced narrative adventure in point-and-click clothing, basically. The sort of spurious premise is that you have got a job helping to organize a party. And through classic point-and-click gameplay, you will go around a lovely little island, a picture book kind of aesthetic island, and collect things like decorations, music, drinks, and cake, and cheer up the inhabitants, basically. That's it in kind of a nutshell.
We also like to say it's a bit like what if Night in the Woods was set on Sesame Street?
Yeah. That's the sort of elevator pitch version.
Yeah.
So that's what Shindig is at its very core. And
So this is our first game together as a team.
yeah.
But we've both been in the games industry for quite some time.
Yeah.
I've clocked up just over 20 years in the industry.
And we've looked up just over 20 years together.
Yeah, that's true.
We've been together forever.
And it's been a sort of long and weird journey from those beginnings to where we are now. Sometimes quite traditional, but other times, quite circuitous as well. So I got into video games just sort of straight out of university, more or less. I did an English literature degree, and I somehow managed to talk my way into a designer job at Sony's London studio. That was at that point. This is when it's PS2 era, so teams are kind of getting bigger, and there's a lot more diversification in terms of individual roles in every team, and the sort of class of designers at the time were nearly all product designers. But I managed to, mainly just by being able to talk articulately about games, but also by talking a lot about narrative and how games could expand in that direction. And which, of course, PS2 time, that's when that's really blowing up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And at that point, I wrote a white paper for Sony, which was shared internationally. It's one of the early kind of proud moments of my career. But so at Sony, I worked mainly on iToy games. You may remember those sort of proto Kinect.
Wishy-washy.
Yeah. So I worked a lot on those, and a whole bunch of things that never went anywhere, like cancelled projects and so on.
Which is the way of like
Oh
huge
yeah,
business,
absolutely,
basically.
absolutely. Like pitched a lot of games to Phil Harrison, that kind of stuff. And from there, we moved where we lived in the country. So I moved on to Codemasters, where I worked on just a tiny little bit on Race Driver Grid and on Operation Flashpoint, and also on a cancelled project there. And after a while, that's when a twist of fate led us to moving to Germany, which is where Nintendo of Europe's head office is.
Yeah.
And we both spent best part of a decade over in Germany at Nintendo of Europe.
Yeah.
So what I was doing there was a kind of hybrid role between, it's partially sort of design consultancy for Nintendo's partners, but also Nintendo's internal teams. But also a kind of long-term strategy planning kind of thing, like a brand strategy. And I think that's probably a good time to switch
over to me.
To Phil.
So as I said, we've been together for absolutely forever. So from my side, it was a bit of a circuitous route into the games industry. I trained in biology and went briefly into the sort of teaching area, basically. Trained to be a teacher, but it just wasn't really the career for me. I really enjoyed it, but I have a lot of strong thoughts about how teachers should be treated. And it was just one of those things where I really love games and games called, basically. So I kind of went from biology and explaining that sort of the scientific methodology to people into using those skills right at the bottom of the ladder, basically in QA. So taking those kind of that methodical mind and using it to actually try and break games and make them better, essentially, which is, I think, really what QA is about. It's much more of a science than people give it credit for. And so from that was at Codemasters, and I worked on a game called Overlords there. And I was very fortunate to not only do QA on that project, but work on some editorial work there, working on the scripts that were provided by an excellent writer called Rhianna Pratchett. And on top of that, I got to do some voice acting there as well, which was really cool and really fun. So that was kind of my Cody's journey. And after that, I worked on Lord of the Rings Online there. And then we both ended up moving. Obviously, he's married, so he's stuck with me. Both ended up moving to Germany, where Nintendo called Martyn. And I was sort of, in a foreign country, kind of climbing the walls of the flat, basically, and ended up kind of going, I've got to do something here. I can't be at home on my own all the time. So I ended up moving into the technical testing side there and got my foot in the door at Nintendo in the lot check department. And I think lots of devs will probably shiver a little bit at the name lot check because obviously, it's part of the process. It has a reputation. It's part of the process you have to go through in order to get your stuff on Nintendo platforms. And simultaneously, I was working just for fun on game reviews and things like that. And
you had a little website.
Yeah. I would, when you could still rent games from like the video store, I rented the games and would play them and, write my thoughts about them. And that led through various different paths to me getting a position as a junior writer at Nintendo. And then I worked up from junior to head of the editorial content marketing team. So I was then hiring writers for Nintendo and writing the game pages, writing the websites at first, writing back of the box text, social media text, that kind of thing. But then as I moved up, also working on things like Nintendo Direct and writing those. So some of the sort of the proudest works of my career have been writing things that Mr. Iwata said, for example. So that, really meaningful stuff. When you're a sort of massive nerd like we are, these little things that you get to do really mean a lot. So I was head of the team there for some time, basically.
But we'd always kind of dreamed we talk a lot about video games. We always have, and we'd always dreamed about actually making something ourselves.
Yeah, because when we first got together, we played through Ocarina of Time together, and we fell in love, and the music was at our wedding and stuff like that. So it's been a long journey, because I liked games way before I met you. It's been one of those things that I've been a gaming kid basically on the old BBC. And you liked games before you met me, and then when we met each other, we were like, great, this is the person for me, because we love the same kind of stuff, But we were at Nintendo for the best part of a decade. In fact, technically longer than that.
Yeah, a little bit.
But mine was in 2 different places. But unfortunately, about 6 years ago, my dad passed away very suddenly. And that led us to sort of have this, reevaluation of what we wanted and where we were at, and, being really far away from family, which at that point we'd been over in Germany for a number of years. And, you miss people back home. And when you have that kind of, I don't know, not existential crisis, but when you have to write someone's eulogy, you find yourself kind of analyzing, like, am I giving back to the world what I want to be giving back? Am I chasing my dreams? Like, are my values aligned with my actions? And is there more that I could be doing to make a difference?
And I think, at the same time, I'd moved into the publishing side at Nintendo, and I was having more and more conversations with like young game developers, and I mean also big companies, and
cool indies, basically.
I was working a lot with cool indies, and you have this conversation where you go, oh wow, man, your game looks super cool, and they're like, oh, it must be great to be the guy from Nintendo. And I'd always be thinking, I don't know though, I would much rather be the person with the cool game. And it might be time to make that move.
So when my dad passed, we really sort of analysed what we wanted and where we wanted to go. Because while working at Nintendo was super awesome in lots of ways, it was also really far from family and friends. And I think we needed the sort of the kick up the butt to actually stop just staying where we were, to stop coasting along basically, and go, where do I actually want to be going? What do I really truly want? And I think we're both incredibly creative people who really just wanted to make something of our own,
and together.
Because when you work for these huge corporations, it's a completely different kind of set of rules and a completely different playing field. And people open your emails when you have Nintendo in your email address.
That's been a difference. But you sort of outsource part of yourself, don't you, when you work for a big company?
Absolutely.
Like, that's part of the deal, and that's cool.
Yeah, because for a long time I sort of stopped writing because, when you write for a big corporation, that's your skills sort of promised to them, as it were. And you can kind of go, I don't want to do that like in my free time necessarily. And I found myself, and I think you found yourself as well, going, you know what, I want these bits of myself and this experience to lead to something that's a completely different challenge. So, I
mean, the thing about working for Nintendo for 10 years, particularly in a sort of design role, is like my career looks like that frame of Spider-Man being like crushed by all the machines, except the machines are NDAs. And so I've done a lot of stuff, but not much I can really openly talk about. And so I wanted something that I could call my own or our own.
So basically we saved and saved and saved, and sort of set a point at which we were like, we're going to have to make a move on following our dreams on this one, basically. So completely different routes, but we were there side by side the whole time.
Really great story. And I really enjoyed Overlord back in the day too. That was one of my favorites.
Really? Cool.
And it's great to hear that you did a lot in terms of QA, because I do agree that it definitely seems like one of those things a lot of people like either misunderstand or they don't really get the importance of it. And for like people watching us record it, like I have spoken at length about the importance of play testing, playability, UI, UX, and it is, I think, one of those things that a lot of people are going to learn the hard way when it comes to their games, in terms of, people don't have the time these days to, mess around with bad elements or frustrating elements of the game.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. I think that the QA is one of those jobs that people really misunderstand. And when I was doing it, I think when you were doing it as well, it's very much a case of like, oh, so you just play games all day and it's just like, oh, I wish that was the case.
You can have a lot of roles in the games industry where you, inverted commas, just play games all day. But it's never really truly that, is it?
And I think having a good QA team and, a good set of that kind of scientific, methodical minds on your QA team can really make or break your progress and your process in actually creating a game, because a good QA is like gold dust, basically.
Yep.
And, things like UI and UX have become increasing concerns over the last, 20 years or so. But, when I first started at Nintendo, that was the DS and Wii era. And a really big thing was there were lots of developers who had either come from outside of the traditional video game environment or had been making games for the traditional gaming audience. And when the audience expanded so much with all the people who were coming to DS and Wii for like the very first console, there were lots of things that you couldn't take for granted that they would know how to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it became a really big part of my job at the time to sort of try and massage that process.
And that's actually pretty relevant for Shindig as well, because with Shindig, one of the things that we wanted to do is just not assume that the player would have those kind of tropes in mind, not assume that the player has played all of the classics and loves Guybrush Threepwood and has played Simon the Sorcerer, and even that they like the new kind of hot thing on the adventure game scene. Just assume that they have no knowledge is a far better way to go about it, because then you can try to make your game more accessible to more people. That's what we're aiming for.
Yeah.
So.
Yep, and like what you were just saying, Marty, about kind of coming in at like the DS, like PlayStation 2 era, that kind of thing. That like a lot of people, I think, who get into the game industry like today or in the last decade, they don't necessarily think about how far things have came, especially the 2000s, like that decade. Like I've been playing video games since 1988, so I've played all of them. I've gone through horrible UIs. I've gotten lost in Castlevania too many times. And there is that misconception, I think, from a lot of people that somebody who buys your game knows every aspect of the genre. They know every bit of the controls. We don't need a tutorial. But that kind of mindset really changed in the 2000s. And it's something I see a lot of indie developers struggle with, that they'll send me their game. It could be a platformer, it could be a RPG. I load up and there is no onboarding. Sometimes I only get a UI bindings. Like I don't even know how to control this game. Now, of course, as a platformer fan, I know all the general layouts that developers have used, but again, it raises that question. You put this in the hands of somebody who's never touched this, they're going to have no idea, use spacebar to jump or up arrow, or I even had one game use comma as the jump button.
Okay, that's a very singular choice.
Yes.
I think with a lot of the tutorial stuff, you kind of have to think about what is the player naturally going to do when you give them these tools. In our case, it's a mouse, basically, that is the controller for Shindig. But, the classic Mario scene of you've got your buttons, you can move left and right. What do these ones do, basically? You've got to kind of assume that your player is going to explore a little bit, but they also need some guidance in terms of what the kind of deeper systems are. You can't just assume that they're going to figure it out, especially not in an RPG or something like that.
Oh, definitely. I mean, there, like, for people watching us record right now, there are a lot of genres that I have bounced off of because of poor onboarding, a lack of a useful tutorial. 4X strategy games are some of my biggies. Like, I can't play the Total War games, Stellaris. Like, I just, like, load those up and my brain just refuses to learn those games. But then I can go and play, like, Bloodborne, and, you know, that's my relaxing game that, you know, helps me sleep.
Well, something that always strikes me is, particularly with mobile games, that a lot of mobile games are explicitly designed that you're going to play them for a very short amount of time, but regularly. But the beginning of those games is often on a completely different sort of time scale, a completely different economy of your time.
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is a game that I want to just pick up, check in on my village or whatever, assign some tasks, and then go about my business. Except in order to get to that place, I've got to spend sort of an hour and a half going through the tutorial at the beginning and all the
click, stop talking,
story elements and stuff like that. And
get all the currencies.
Kind of thing.
All the characters are talking at you. They've got to explain every single nested microtransaction, and you're just going, stop talking, let me get to the game.
Yeah. And, like, a lot of mobile games, I think, they're really designed around, like, solid UI UX, or at least onboarding the player, because they want to get them to that point of, okay, you've learned everything, now give us your credit card information and start opening up loot boxes. Yeah, and I guess for both of you, since you've both worked, you know, at, like, Sony, Nintendo, you've had a chance to, like, kind of see things from the AAA side. How do those come out? Again, if this is NDA breaking, please let me know. How do these companies, I guess, treat UI and UX? Because, like, I've spoken to indie developers, I've interviewed a whole lot of them, and most indie devs either go right into the game industry, like right out of college, or they may spend, like, a little bit of time at a AA or AAA studio, and then they go on their own. So they don't necessarily, I think, have, like, that, you know, like, the corporate or the high level of what these companies are actually, like, thinking about in terms of these topics.
Okay, so when I was at Sony, that was kind of at the beginning of people using user interface as a term. I don't think UX had really started being adopted then, but I can remember us having these discussions about a number of button presses until gameplay, for example, and it being like quite a revolutionary concept at the time of, like, you know, you want it to be that the title screen comes up and you want one or maybe two button presses until gameplay. And, like, that's very much the embryonic stage of considering it. So it was being considered. This is the early 2000s. And Nintendo, definitely, what I was doing at the time in the Wii and DS period was a thing called Mario Club Europe, which was specifically for these kind of new developers to help with things like UI and UX, because of those Nintendo consoles having, like, what was at the time a new input method. Because there were, you know, I don't think even phones had touch screens at that point. Maybe some, but, you know, this is a new point of touchscreens, and, you know, the Wii remote and things like that. So they're, like, quite
it was
accessible.
Stylus based. It was like, you know, Blackberries and stuff like that. But I think definitely in my sort of experience through the industry, that kind of thing became more and more important. Obviously, with the sort of the rise of the internet, basically, where you're really talking about, like you said, the number of clicks, but in terms of the user journey through websites and things like that, in order to get the user from that first landing page through to knowing where they're going to be looking for the information they want. Is there a search bar where they want it? How far are they going to scroll down? What's underneath the fold and that kind of stuff? And I think that kind of design overall in the industry, not just within games themselves, but actually in the sort of the sales platforms for games, the websites
Yeah.
and the sort of the eShop equivalents, as it were.
Mhm.
Like that became so important that I think nobody could avoid really thinking about it, to be honest.
No, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because of course, from the beginning of the 2000s to now, there's this sort of journey across a lot of different forms of media where suddenly everything has a UI and a UX.
And suddenly it's not dial-up anymore, it's broadband.
Yeah.
So you have a natural evolution of what you can present to users, whether you can have like a homepage takeover or something like that that's real flashy. That was quite the sort of in vogue thing for a while,
Yeah.
basically. But I think, long story short, it's more and more important. And now with people thinking about accessibility more, just in general, in terms of being inclusive for their users, for their players, it's only a positive thing, really.
Yeah.
And it's definitely something that there are teams, actually devoted to.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely become an interesting discussion about kind of like approachability and accessibility, as I think a lot of people still conflate those terms, and it's still, again, getting back to what we were saying about like QA and playtesting, still not really understood, I think, by enough people in the industry. Because, as we've said, the market has certainly changed. More people are playing games, and like again, like being like around during the PS2 DS era, like that's when controllers, for instance, have standardized. Anyone who played video games in the 90s remembers having like 5 different controller layouts for every system.
Yep.
And
those were the days.
yes. Yeah. I'm sure everyone else is like loving having to mess around with that. And it's just very, I think, challenging for a lot of developers, because so much, I think, of what makes a game marketable these days, you don't really, I think, know, even when you're developing the game, or even if you work at major studios. Like, the games that we see that go on to be, like, the year winners, the ones that get talked about for years on end, so much in terms of design, approachability, UI, accessibility, and even, like, marketing PR has to be factored in. And like I just made a tweet about this earlier today, that I feel that the bottom and even maybe like the middle of the indie market is starting to kind of drop out because of that. Because if your game doesn't ship with solid UI UX, if it doesn't have a strong marketing behind it day one, or I'm sorry, probably negative day 3 to 4 months these days, it's so easy for these games to slip through the cracks. And like I cover like anywhere from like 12 to 15 indie games a week just by streams and videos. That's nothing. Like 30 games are released a day now.
Yeah. Visibility is a real challenge for indies like us.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think as well the tricky thing is that even if you do have those things in place, like we've been in the industry for 20 years, so we have quite a lot of skills in terms of the sort of the content marketing and the design and the writing about it, the QA side. And for Shindig, we had to get the other skills as well. But in terms of being able to write a good game page, for example, I can do that. I can write you a social campaign. And if people like us are still struggling within that landscape with these, let's be honest, pretty high level skills when it comes to that kind of stuff, I really can't imagine how hard it is for other indies who don't have that background in those areas. It's really, really tough. And I think in a lot of cases, having a publisher really helps with your visibility and stuff like that. And I think that was kind of one of the areas that we chose not to have a publisher for Shindig. We very much wanted it to be just, we've made this game and we did like every single part of it, basically. And because it's a very personal kind of property, we obviously wanted that just 100% ours. But I think that having a publisher can make so much difference in terms of visibility, in terms of who's going to sort of, pitch your game for you, basically, to their contacts and things like that, or what visibility you're going to get in showcases or at events and things.
If nothing else, it's simply just more hands on deck, right?
Yeah, totally.
In the case of us, every hour spent promoting the game is an hour not spent developing the game.
Yeah.
And vice versa.
Absolutely.
And if you do happen to have the resources of a publisher, or greater resources in that sense, just in the sense that someone can be doing that while you are still working on your game, or while you're appearing on a podcast, say, is an absolutely invaluable resource.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and like the downside though is that I know there are a lot of people who have trouble with publishers. That publishers who don't do enough work, or how much are you really getting out of that interaction? And like for every story that we hear of an indie developer who does break out and has that big game, there's probably several hundreds that don't, and it is tough. Like, this is one of the reasons why I really focus with Game Wisdom to cover indie games, to try and get as much of, try to blast the air horn on these titles, because there are lots of games that I really enjoy that have, sub 200 reviews, sometimes sub 100 reviews on Steam. And even though I enjoyed those games, I know they weren't, market
Profitable
successes, or even, earning back their development costs.
No, it's a very real problem, and I think something has happened over the last 10 years or so, I guess, with in the indie space. It's very akin to indie music in sort of the late 90s, early 2000s, where
Being hassled back.
what it meant to be indie meant something, and then where it meant one thing. And then as time went on, that meaning changed, and it stopped being, well, for example, you would assume perhaps that indie means independent, means no publisher, or in the case of music, like no record label. But then after a while, it becomes, indie is guitar bands, and this is an indie band, even though they are on a huge record label and playing massive stadium tours and stuff like that. And something similar, I think, has happened with games, where at one point there was this idea of like, let's support indies. They're like just regular Joes, real artistic expression. It's not these big companies. But over time, it's mutated to just mean a particular style of game, sometimes made by a 50-person team with a multi-publishing arm.
Yeah. And there's different grades of indies within indie, who obviously have different resources available. So it's a minefield, long story short, basically. And I'm not really sure the way out of it.
Yeah, I mean, we've had meme discussions here on this channel about, what is an indie developer these days? Is it, having only having 2 international studios out there, or is it just having, one person working on the game for 20 years of their life with no help? And it is such a tricky thing. And again, like, over the last 10 years, I think has been, like I've said this before, I think the last decade has really been defined as kind of the rise of the indie developer. That it's, again, we look at games coming out in 2010 to 2019 in terms of what the indie space could accomplish. It is, night and day, and that's how this industry oftentimes moves.
Yeah.
But the issue, though, is that it's getting harder and harder for any one of these games to stand out unless it hits it out of the park. That if it's not, a Celeste or a Hades or a Disco Elysium, people oftentimes don't care about it. The deck-building roguelike genre is one that I really love. Slay the Spire, Monster Train are some of my favorite games, and I know there are people who outright refuse to play those games anymore because they've just been flooded by them. Even if they're better or different in some respect, it's the same thing with platformers, which is the same thing as in RPGs and shooters and whatever. And again, like, I don't have the answer for it either, because
No, but there's also the fact that with an indie, you named Hades there, for example, but they previous to that had Bastion, which was actually a huge multi-platform hit, and they had Pyre and Transistor, and they're all fantastic games made by this really, really close-knit team, as far as we can tell. And they obviously they've got something fantastic going on there, and they're just building and building to greater heights. I just turned 40 and I got Hades for my birthday with my birthday money. And
Nice.
it's so good. It's just, it's mind-bogglingly good. The voice acting, the art, everything is beautiful.
But it's that culmination of that journey that started with
Exactly.
Bastion. Right?
Exactly.
Yep.
And so, it's not like Supergiant Games are sort of 3 or 4 college kids,
Yep.
Yeah. And they're not just a little tiny married couple making games with their cats in their house.
Yeah, and it takes time. Like, again, like 10 years ago, nobody really was thinking about Supergiant Games, and like sometimes I feel like a lot of the development is just surviving long enough to get that one hit. That you can just keep going until you get your Celeste or your version of something like I was just doing a video about Batman Arkham Asylum, that Rocksteady was unknown very much before that game came out, and it defined the studio for them, much like Celeste did, Disco Elysium, Motion Twin with Dead Cells. Like, they've been doing games for I think like 15, 16 years, and nobody's ever heard of them until Dead Cells came out.
But the thing is, like,
Motion Twin had some DSiWare games. Perhaps you might have played Alpha Bounce and DSi. I did.
But things like, the new era of Batman, basically, the Arkham series kind of brought in something that then everybody else was aping, with the sort of the slow down and the really crunchy combat, which is just so satisfying. And it becomes something where somebody innovates in that way, and then it becomes a sort of genre trope. Which is kind of beautiful in one way, but it also leads to the sort of, we joke about the grand sublimation of AAA, basically.
Yeah, well, AAA is a genre.
Yeah, AAA is
almost.
It's a genre now.
I make fun of like the whole like Ubisoft open world genre. I call it like open world games, where it's just the same thing again and again, and it is, again, that very hard line to walk in terms of how much you innovate and how much you iterate on these titles. Because, again, for both of you coming from doing a QA and working at studios like this, you understand that you can't just make whatever the heck you want, just like throw things at the wall and hope it sells 5 million copies. Like, it takes, like, I understand very much. Yeah. I would like that too.
Wouldn't it be nice if you could just rock up and be like, "Hey, I made a game. It's whatever I fancied making." No, and I think that's why we chose to make what we did with Shindig, because obviously we had this sort of weird situation where we have these really high level skills in QA and writing and design and that kind of knowledge of the publisher side of kind of things, but to make a game, you need to have visuals on screen. You need to have sound effects. You need to have music as well.
Yeah, I mean, prior to Shindig, I hadn't written a line of code or opened Unity.
Yeah, exactly. We sort of joke that Shindig is the game that you get if you take an artist that can't draw and a coder that can't code, and they make a game anyway, because it is like indie, and creating a game is such it's a weird melange of like different hats that you have to wear, basically. And if you don't have the skills as an indie, you either have to get them or you have to outsource them, or you have to hope that you can kind of make something that's interesting that doesn't require them. And for us, we figured out, okay, we need to make a game that does something interesting, basically, in order for it to even have a chance in this market, because there's so many games and visibility is so hard that I think if we tried to do that kind of thing where it's like, I want to make
Pardon me.
more of what already exists, you really have no chance of standing out.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, we figured out that an adventure game was like the primary kind of game we wanted to make, because it kind of played to our strengths, you know, with the dialogue writing and the script and
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
narrative, character heavy.
Exactly. But also, we felt like we could bring something new to the landscape of adventure games in order to sort of make it that sort of viable business proposition, really. And that's as yet to be proven.
Yeah.
But like you say, these things start slow. You can't just rock up and expect your first game to be a day one smash.
Well, we had this idea of what we talk about as human scale game development.
Yeah.
Because we've worked at a massive scale,
Mm.
like on this sort of corporate global scale. And what we wanted to try to do with Shindig was just see what we could do, just the two of us. You know, what if an indie game could be like a gigging band, where the idea is not necessarily to, as music metaphor again, but it's not necessarily to be playing those stadium gigs immediately. It's more just like, you know, pay for the petrol in the van and, you know, go to the next gig.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, we were just kind of trying to get underway and get
some skills under our
yeah,
belt.
absolutely.
Because there are so many hats that you have to wear as an indie dev. But I think that with Shindig, it's one of those, I mean, it's a strange little hybrid of a game, and I think that's what a lot of people are confused, are confused about, because you can't really tell at first glance, you know, what it is, because it's not Simon the Sorcerer, or, you know, it's not a Monkey Island. You don't have that main character who's right there on the front being like, you get to play this guy.
Yeah, it's not explicitly drawing on that tradition.
Yeah.
Which I think a lot of adventure games do, and there's nothing wrong with that. But, you know, there's always this conflict between, you can make a game which is it's a cross between popular game A and popular game B.
Yeah.
And there's a good side to that, which is everybody knows what it is you're making. But then there's a bad side, which is that, you know, really you're in competition with popular game A and popular game B, and it's the other games that combine parts of those two. And
which games are going to cannibalize which other games is always the question, basically. But I think that there's room for everybody in the indie space. I truly believe that it's not we can't have a scarcity mentality about this, because, you know, it's just more games for everybody to enjoy. And while, of course, you want your game to be successful and to make money so you can keep making more games, I think that even if you tried to very closely copy what someone else is doing, you'll copy different things, or the wrong things, or maybe go in specific directions. It's that sort of Pixar versus DreamWorks side of things, where they have these very different
absolutely
takes on how to do a human face, how to communicate with these sort of little avatar characters and things like that. Tropes that you see through both those companies' movies, but they're done in such different ways that they bring completely different things to those audiences.
Yep, and I think the study of game design still needs to be greater appreciated by a lot of people, being able to understand what goes into a game in terms of success, what it doesn't do right. It's one of the things that I do with a lot of the games I look at on Game Wisdom, and like people who watch me or they leave me comments are like, how do you understand this stuff? And it's just like, I've done it so much that, you know, it comes second nature to me, like breathing. But it is, I think, a very underappreciated and underutilized skill when it comes to these games, because, again, I think this goes back to the role of QA and playtesting, that there are games that I've played that I know within 2 minutes whether or not this game is going to be good or bad, like just in terms of how it feels in my hands. And like these are titles that people work on for years. And they will miss these issues. And it is that very much that case of, if you don't know where to look for the problems, you're going to end up stumbling into them, whether you want to or not.
Yeah. And I think as well, there's a lot of misunderstanding in terms of how design really works, and who things are being designed for. With Shindig, for example, we're aiming for that more universal audience. So we can't, in order to be able to accommodate those people, we can't have only hard puzzles, which are all about combining items, and we can't expect people to have those genre tropes in mind of, I've got to pixel hunt here, that kind of thing. Things still have to be reasonably sized so that when you're mousing around you can find them. And I think that there's a lot of sort of conflicting views on what a game should be from different sort of player groups, because basically a lot of people really just want a game to be really perfectly catered to them. They just want to enjoy whatever game they've bought as much as they possibly can. But from the developer side, it's not just made for that one person. It's made for so many different players, which is why we put things in like closed captions, for example, for our hard of hearing players. They're not for you if you can hear. You don't need to put them on. But they're there and they add something if you are hard of hearing, but it's no skin off your nose if you leave them on,
Yeah, a lot of people say they like to leave them on because they're funny.
But I think designing for your exact audience is often misunderstood. And for us, the audience was a lot wider because we wanted it to be the kind of game that parents could play with their kids. Like, we didn't target it specifically at kids, despite the sort of cartoony art style. But we wanted it to be something where, it didn't have swearing in it. It's not scary. There's no like tonal bait and switch, which is like really, really popular in these cutesy kind of cozy games. It's like, oh no, and then suddenly someone's head gets bitten off,
Yeah, that's true. It's not a hidden horror game.
It's not. But that's because we've very deliberately designed Shindig to be sort of encompassing and welcoming to more types of players, which means that you can sort of find the situation where people are going like, I would have liked it to have harder puzzles, and other people going, the puzzles were just right for me. It's like, how do you please all of the people all of the time? You really can't. So you've just got to sort of fit it to your vision as best you can.
Well, and in an ideal world, that's what indie should be about, right?
Yes.
That there can be so many more games now, and games can reach so many more people, that you should be able to make something that's quite a personal work or quite a niche work, or combination of all of the above, and hopefully somehow find an audience for that.
But I think that there's always the difficulty whenever you're starting out like we are. We don't have a back catalogue of games where people can know what to expect. We're like, even with all this experience under our belts, we're essentially nobodies in the indie sphere, So I don't think we ever expected Shindig to be like a day one smash, 1 million units sold. It's not like in those huge companies where you're really looking at exactly day one and then course correcting if it didn't go exactly how you expected it to.
Yeah, that's true.
I think when you're an indie, you have that long tail of just trying to build up your reputation almost, basically, as somebody who can finish a project and ship a game, because that's a minor miracle whenever that happens, and B, the kind of games that you make and the kind of dynamics and different possibility spaces and emotional landscapes that you put within your games. You have to get a kind of relationship with the player base, essentially, that they would know what they're to expect from you.
Yeah,
basically.
But there certainly is an amount of whiplash from our previous roles, where you would look at sales of a particular game and be like, oh, no, it hasn't gone so well. Which for other people in other bits of the games industry, that would be like, amazing. It's
Yeah,
Yep.
I could buy a house with that.
yeah, exactly,
Basically.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But,
And that actually takes me to a question that I want to ask both of you. It's something I always like to ask people who come from the AAA or more, major studio side in the indie sphere. What has been kind of like, I guess, like the biggest shocker or the biggest challenge that you didn't expect working in the indie space? And the reason why I like to ask this question is that I know a lot of the people who follow me are either first-time indies or students thinking about getting in the game industry. And again, as we said, often like that juxtaposition between the AAA side and the indie side is very muddied for them.
yeah.
Okay, this isn't exactly an answer to your question, but something that when this is put to me by people, I think it's important to have an understanding that being an indie game developer, or even just being a game developer of your own products, your own projects, is really a almost completely different proposition, a completely different role
Yeah.
to working on a game for a AAA studio.
Yeah.
Not just in the sense that AAA studios have a massive specialization
Yeah.
in every role. Like I'm sure there are more than one person in charge of making urns for Assassin's Creed at Ubisoft, for example.
Yeah.
Whereas, if there are urns in my game, you've got to draw them.
It's true.
Unless they're going to be kind of rubbish looking urns, and then I could do them.
Mhm.
But and you on one side of the coin, you will never have the kind of security making your own art, let's say, as you would making the urns. But you will also never really feel the same level of ownership over anything that you work on that you had just this small part. And I personally know that I've had quite some influence on these big projects, but it's still not something that I can claim ownership myself.
Yeah.
And
you're still making their art whenever you work for a big corporation.
Yeah. And Shindig belongs to us.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful, and it has a value, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest sort of shockers from my side would be that when you go from working for a big corporation, you have a certain amount of leverage regardless. The kind of things and social campaigns and stuff that I would write previously don't necessarily work for an indie, because a big company like Nintendo or like Sony or Codemasters or something, they have a captive audience already. Basically,
yeah, that's true.
Everybody already knows that they like Nintendo games because they're great. They don't have to grow or gain an audience, really. And sure, there are some posts that go better than others. That's something that in my previous job we would watch quite carefully, and you try to maximize all of your metrics, basically. When you're an indie, those same kind of campaigns basically fall on deaf ears, and you have to kind of claw from the very bottom to try and get an audience. And that's actually very difficult to do. And a lot of it is about consistency. And a lot of it is about luck, basically. And a lot of it is about just sort of perseverance and tenacity, being tenacious and keeping at it. I think from our side, we've been doing social posts for like 2 years, and one of the things that's always in those articles of how to market your indie game is like, get your social channels, post regularly, try to use pictures, try to use videos or GIFs or that kind of thing. So it's eye-catching. And you can do that stuff till the cows come home. But when you're an indie, you need a lot more luck involved in that, because Nintendo can just put out that kind of thing and people will respond. But as an indie, you're kind of just drowning in amongst a sea of tweets.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a meritocracy.
No, it's not a meritocracy at all.
Yep. Like we do a Steam Store page review shows here on the channel as well, and it's that what you just said there exactly about the difference between a AAA and indie developer. That Nintendo, like Nintendo can put up, a cardboard drawing of a character, or just say cardboard that says "coming soon." It will probably get 300,000 likes on Twitter.
Yeah.
For an indie developer, you have to work probably 500 to 1,000 times harder than that in terms of making your store page and doing the marketing. And it's one of those things that, like, I've been following indie devs again for like the last decade, and so many games I've played, just like they even make like a ripple in a small pond. They just came and disappeared, and it is hard, and it's one of the reasons why, again, like for people watching us, that I do Game Wisdom to try and expand on what it means to succeed. Because again, like for both of you, like you've seen working at Nintendo and Sony games that have made, they've sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and that's still considered a failure to them. Just as I've seen indie developers who they spend like 5 years working on a game, it gets maybe 50 reviews, and it doesn't matter the quality of the game, doesn't matter how much those 50 people really enjoyed it, it's still a failed game.
I think I'm going to sort of caveat that and say it came out, so no game is a failed game. But of course, everybody wants their game to be as much of a success as it possibly can be. You want it to pay the bills, I sort of made a tweet recently where I said, like, I'm 40, I have 4 years alcohol free, and I just released my first game, and right now it's kind of a flop, basically. Like it's only been out a month, admittedly, but when you do all of those things where you put out the press releases and you email the press and you kind of go down the checklist of all the things that we're used to doing to market a game, and all the extra ones that you have more ownership of, like making trailers and having a website and this and that kind of thing. When you do all of that, you can still sort of slip through the gaps, basically, even with multinational corporation level skills at play.
Like you said, and then it becomes about perseverance, because you just can't be quiet about it.
Yeah,
can't shut up.
Yeah.
If you want someone to hear you, got to keep shouting.
Because there's a great deal of indie marketing that happens in the game making process, essentially, not just by tweeting regularly about it or having dev vlogs and things like that, but by making your game the best game it can be, by making sure that the actual product is polished and has that spark or that thing that makes it unique, basically.
And then hopefully reaches a solvable problem.
Exactly. And then when your game is out, basically, your marketing ramps up, and hopefully you've ironed out all the bugs that you can, and that the product in the hands of users will lead to things like word of mouth, basically. That's, I think, the best thing that an indie developer can do for marketing is actually ship a game, because until you do, you're a kind of an untested prospect. So many indies fall by the wayside, and there's that kind of cliche of, I started making this game and then I got this crazy idea in my head that was just so good, so I had to work on
game.
And we had this rule with Shindig that we've got like a big flip chart that we bought that is just like covered in game ideas, because obviously we want to make lots of different types of games. But we had this rule of, we're not working on them until this is done. We are stay on target, stay focused, because the best thing you can do to market anything and market yourselves is to finish the damn project.
Yep. And like you said, there are so many indie developers who they either commit so much to a game that it takes like 5 to 10 years of their lives and it may never even get finished, or they're just bouncing from project to project and never really kind of making something cohesive that you can put out into the space.
Yeah. And I think that it is very hard to actually finish a project. Like I said earlier, I truly believe that any indie game that comes out is a success on some form, even if I do sort of almost flippantly say, oh, my game is a flop kind of thing. Like it's still a game that you shipped. That's still an incredible achievement. But I think that in terms of trying to offer something to people, there is no downside to having more games under your belt, basically. More that people can go to your website to see. If you can make videos and things like that, it's really hard to do that kind of stuff and make that art as well.
Yeah, that's true. The whole thing that these days indies are sort of behooved to make art to sell their art.
Yeah.
And like we said before, it's a matter of the amount of manpower you have.
Yep.
Because you are with not necessarily the access to the same kind of access to the games press, the same kind of access to places to advertise. I mean, obviously, like indies don't
just
have
a foot
TV
in the
ads,
door
but
with people. Realistically, the best thing you can do to market your games is to make the games, basically, and not shut up about them. That's the best kind of learning that I've had from it.
Yeah.
And it's a real shocker going from big business to being the small guy that nobody really will listen to.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got to be a noisy cricket.
Yeah, like one of my favorite guests I spoke to was Jake Burgett from Grey Alien Games, and
Who's fantastic. Yeah.
He's been doing this for I think now over 20 years. And like he had his famous GDC talk, how to survive in the game industry without one big hit. And like I've spoken to him multiple times, and like he's like been very true about like the times that he's suffered, that like he was close to going bankrupt. And it very much, I think, for a lot of indie devs, that you kind of just have to keep pushing forward and growing at the same time. And it is very difficult. Again, like there are developers that I'm sure you found a few yourself. I'm sure everyone watching this, like they put out one amazing game, it does well. You think, this studio is going place, it's going to be amazing, and then they close like a year to 2 years later, and they're just not able to keep that momentum going. And why it is such a big deal when we have developers who are in the space even just 5 years of surviving, like let alone 10, 15, 20 in some of the cases of some of the more older indie devs.
I think that part of that as well comes down to the scope of your project and what's realistic. For example, even though we've been in the games industry for 20 years, when we set out to make Shindig, we at first, like if you look back at our dev blog posts, at first they say Shindig will be about 1 to 2 hours long. And we have all like had the puzzles essentially designed from the very beginning. Yeah. But then when you make the game, it takes longer to make than you possibly could have imagined. Everything takes 10 times longer, and then you multiply that by another factor of 10 too. But also the game that you make might actually be longer for a player as well. It might just be that you've completely misunderstood how long that amount of puzzles will take to play.
Yeah.
Shindig actually takes more like 3 hours, 4 if you kind of like mooch everywhere and do everything and you take your sweet time, which please do. It's a nice place to hang out. But at first we genuinely thought, these puzzles, these interactions, this exploration.
Yeah, this is a tiny little game.
It's a short game. And somebody that we were speaking to the other day said, Shindig is not a short game. It's more like what I would consider a medium-sized game, they said.
I was very proud.
Okay, that's cool. But realistically, when we designed Shindig, we sat down and kind of hashed out the puzzles. It took us a couple of days to do that. We wrote the script and it was more or less all there. And then the rest of it took 2 years to make, because there's so many different environments, and all of that set of puzzles actually accommodates 3 to 4 hours of gameplay. So it's very, very difficult to judge, even when you have experience of the development process.
Scale and scope is incredibly difficult. It's true.
Yeah. There were things that we would have liked to have done with Shindig that we actually de-scoped for reasons of designing the emotional landscape of the game, but also in terms of this game is never going to get finished if we do all of this. We had the idea at first that instead of just getting certain things for the party, you could have different grades of those things, like in Final Fantasy, where you can get, the different.
You can dress Cloud up.
You can dress Cloud up as different things. And you can get like the best pants and stuff. But after a while, we realized that putting in all of that on top of what we designed, it didn't actually help the emotional landscape of the game being a welcoming, safe, happy place.
Exactly. We didn't want it to be that you could not make us a good enough party. Like, oh, this has been an okay party, thanks. So we didn't want that to be a scenario that a player could have. So actually those things
fell by the wayside, and I'm glad of it, because if we had tried to put those in, which was our initial thought, there's always a lot more going on under the hood than any player ever could possibly realize. But that would have been just another level of, like a huge level of
content that people might not see as well.
That people won't see, that they won't necessarily enjoy, and that would actually lead to a negative for the game. Yeah. But it's about scope. It really is.
Mm-hmm. And again, going back to what we were saying earlier, you never know exactly the kind of audience that you're dealing with as well. That somebody else is going to be completely new to this and will struggle with it, or they're going to be really amazing and just, I beat the entire game in 40 minutes. What else do you have, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the kind of game you're making, the assumptions you can make about your player. Like with Shindig, because we really designed it to be more of a sort of narrative experience that has that kind of... We jokingly said it was a talking simulator at first, and then it became like a mooching sim. Because it's, it's a bag of jokes and hope held together loosely with puzzles. We're not trying to make real head scratchers there.
Yeah.
But I think that means that you can have these more loose assumptions about your player. And that can cause problems in terms of getting the difficulty level exactly right.
And also the tone and the content too, because we have not really touched on it that much, but Shindig has a sort of more serious side. It does have, it's not all 100% sort of positivity. We wanted to sort of address some more kind of real feelings in there. And, knowing how to balance that out is also another important tonal consideration.
Yeah, because while we wanted to bring that kind of optimistic, cheerful, cozy experience to the adventure game landscape and make it so that, everything from the art to the music to the words that each of the characters use is sort of welcoming and not particularly challenging. It's not supposed to be gatekeeping and saying you don't get to play the last half of the game because you couldn't solve this puzzle. But just in general, trying to make it something that lots of different people can find accessible, basically. But in terms of those universality of the stories. So we have the cheerful side of the main game, but then there's these hangouts that have, like you said, slightly deeper emotional topics, I guess, touched on.
Real talk.
Yeah, exactly. But having those in there is one of those things that we could have easily just not done them.
But it's the heart of the game, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that when you make assumptions about your players, you kind of have to give them a little bit of credit that they can really handle an optimistic, cheerful game that has this kind of real talk aspect in it and broaches things like invisible disability and, workplace bullying and things like that, in order to create something that seems a little bit more real. Because I think that otherwise Shindig would just be really sickly sweet, and that can be kind of off-putting.
Yeah.
I do think overall people get it.
Yeah.
And that's really gratifying.
So we are, I think, a little bit over an hour.
yeah.
It seems like we just got started. I do have a few more general questions for both of you regarding Shindig. Then I think we'll wrap things up. And if the two of you are free in the future, I don't want to keep you up all night long. We can certainly have another discussion about kind of play testing and QA design.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't notice that it's 1:45 here, so
Yeah.
I'm quite happy talking to you. Please fire away with your questions.
Okay.
Try to
So
be
I guess
concise.
I guess the one that I want to ask: how long was a Shindig in development for?
Okay.
Well, so roughly 2 years.
Yeah.
But that's considering that we were both completely new to our sides of the game beyond design and writing.
Yeah.
That's 2 years from the first time I opened Unity and the first time you
Oh, that seems like
started
so
drawing
long ago.
like the game in Photoshop and looking into animations and things like that.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, in terms of that 2 years, like I said, it took a few days to design the puzzles and to really kind of flesh them out how we wanted them to be, because we had this very clear vision of, we want it to be an island, we want it to be gated at a certain point where you can't progress to Act 2 kind of thing. And we had this very defined structure of the paciness of the game and how it should accelerate towards the end and that kind of stuff, all nailed down within the first few days. The script we thought about and we wrote down some jokes and mulled it over, and then we wrote that within a few days. Then it basically went a year of drawing the environments, animating the characters, doing the soundtrack, doing the sound effects, because literally everything in Shindig, we made it.
Yeah, it's entirely homegrown.
Other than the engine, because that way lies burnout.
That's true.
But we had to have this division of labor because you were basically the Unity guy. Martyn was everything under the hood in Unity in terms of implementation. That's all him, which is a humongous prospect. And everything to do with sound and vision basically was my side of things. But that meant that we were starting completely from scratch in all those different areas, basically. So the stuff that we were already good at took a couple of days.
Yes.
Then we had to make everything for a year. And then we basically did QA for a year. Because there's just the two of us. And we did get some friends in and some trusted developer mates who very kindly helped to test the game. But that was very much towards the end of the process. That was this summer. And we'd been working on the game for a year and a half before that. And really, it's one of those things where you don't realize how long it takes to learn to do a walk cycle. You don't realize how long it's going to take, even with the essentially the animation Bible by my side. It takes a really long time to get your head around that stuff, and thank God for YouTube. Basically,
people go to college to learn just that one thing.
It's not something you can just be good at straight away. So we knew that we had to have a certain realisticness to our expectations of what we could do, having never drawn a game before, or having never, I'm not a trained musician, but I did the entire soundtrack for Shindig and all of the voice and the sound effects and stuff. And that's just a lot of learning. So it's a really slow process. So 2 years to make a game that lasts 3 to 4 hours, which is mostly sort of exploration and narrative gameplay, basically.
But it's our launching pad.
It's a launching pad. Yeah, I feel way more able to handle a lot of the different kinds of ideas that I said we had written on our flip chart. Because I now know how I would go about beginning that even. I know how to rig and bone a character and set up their animations. And that's something I hopefully don't have to relearn.
As long as it's not too long until I have to do these things again.
Yeah.
And that is something that I hear from a lot of developers about how much it is important to grow from project to project, to be able to use what you've learned from one game to your next. Because if you're not growing, you're not improving, then you're just making those same mistakes over and over again. And once again, for people watching, like, I've seen developers who have struggled with that lesson time after time again.
Yeah. I think that's... Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, like, yeah, you can go one way or the other, and either way, if not judged perfectly, can lead to destruction, right? You can make one game and then make an entirely different game, and then you don't transfer any of the skills that you learned in the first one, and you're ground zero again.
Yeah, I think for us, just to give a little shout out as well, we decided to make a point and click game as our first game, to lean into our strengths, but also because we used something called Adventure Creator. So that's actually a paid product which costs about £50 or £60. I'm not quite sure of the exact price, but it basically it sells itself on the idea that you can make a game without having to write a single line of code. You can make those classic sort of adventure games of yesteryear, and it's got all of these wonderful options to allow you to do that. As it stands, you did learn a bunch of coding because we had some specific ideas of what we wanted to do. But where you can, it really helps if you can give yourself a framework to kind of have that structure for your project, to say,
to build out.
These are the things that I can do within this genre of game.
Yeah.
And these are the tools that kind of come out of the box for that.
And you have a certain amount of support as well from the community around those game engines, and that's also been invaluable.
Absolutely. So, highly recommend Adventure Creator. It's one of those things where, we didn't make the point and click because they're trendy or the big resurgence of them. We made a point and click. I love point and clicks, always have. But we also just really wanted to be able to build on the skills that we were learning so that we can use them for future games. And
from a steady foundation.
Absolutely. And Adventure Creator and making a point and click gives us that kind of grounding of, well, now I know how to put the music in, now I know how to do X, Y, and Z. And so for the next project, I can feasibly reuse some of those assets, or I can build on that knowledge in order to make something where I'm not just reinventing the wheel,
Yeah, and it doesn't take 2 years, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Yep, and I mean, I've interviewed other adventure game developers here on the channel, like Dave Gilbert.
Right. Amazing games.
Yeah, and I'm still thinking about like the whole market for the adventure game genre. Like, we don't have the time to get into that tonight, that's for sure.
Oh, it's huge.
Yeah, but one thing that I wanted to go back to with Shindig, in terms of the actual like development, as you said, like in terms of like the mechanics and the structure of the game, you had that figured out relatively early into its development. Like, getting back to, or like fitting this back into our topic about like the market and the audience, how did you decide, I guess the complexity of Shindig? Like, for those of you watching, I did finish the game off stream, and like I did look up like a few things just in terms of like finding, like, I think it was where all the lemons were. Like, I had to like remind myself where that was. But in terms of like how challenging did you want to make this game? Because as you said on the store page, it's not really aimed at kids, but it's still, a kind of like fun for the whole family kind of game. So how did you approach that from like a mechanic or just design standpoint?
Okay, so one of the first principles I think we had was that while a lot of adventure games are really built and sold around these like very difficult, very often abstract puzzles, sort of lateral thinking challenges, that for us, in the point and click games that we loved, I kind of felt like the best puzzles in a point and click are the ones that get you to visit a new place or meet a new person.
Yes.
And so I often like to think that, okay, if a point and click game, the dialogue and the characters are just as much game mechanics as, say, jumping would be in a platform game.
Yeah.
And so in that platform game, you do things like place coins and rings and stuff like that to guide players through the experience. And the puzzles are kind of our equivalent of those coins or those rings. That we didn't want them to be a blocker. We didn't want it to be, sometimes, particularly with action games, say you can get to a boss and you try your absolute best and you just can't get past it. And it's like, well, that's the end of the game now for me, I guess.
Absolutely.
We didn't want it to be like that for anybody.
So we kind of designed the puzzles around observation, essentially. The kind of thing where, realistically, if you go around this world and you listen to these characters and you investigate everything, we've put enough clues in different places, repeated clues, that will point you in the right direction, in order that you will make a logical leap at some point, and then a sort of domino effect will start to fall. And that was kind of, I think, the key for... We mentioned there's 2 different acts of Shindig, and Act 1 of Shindig has this very sort of domino effect kind of design principle
Zelda-like
to
trading
it,
quest.
which is very much about looking, exploring, meeting the characters, listening to what they're saying, and then at some point you go, oh, holy cow, do I have to give that to... And that sort of logically pursuant kind of puzzle cascade would happen. And I think for us, it was important to do that because it works really well in games, in Zelda games, for example, or in much smaller kind of games like Frog Detective, for example, which only take like 20 minutes, half an hour to play. But that kind of beautifully self-contained idea of you're going to get there eventually, as long as you're paying attention, really, was the main kind of design principle for us.
And just to sort of move people around the island, get them talking to all the different characters, and hoping that sort of rotation would eventually lead you home or lead you to the Shindig.
Yeah, because we had designed a bunch of much tougher puzzles that were a lot more sort of classical adventure style, basically. But we discussed it and we essentially went, that kind of thing isn't that accessible to all audiences. And the game is presented in such a way as it's all about communicating to the player via the visuals, via having like the subtitle speech bubbles up on screen. By this very simple interface of, it's not the classic ScumVM interface or anything like that. It's just, you've got interact, so you just investigate, you explore, basically. And if we could have puzzles that rewarded the player for exploring and rewarded the player for being kind, because we haven't really spoken about it, but kindness is one of the main kind of tenets of and themes of Shindig. If we could create a world in which that general ambience of the world and the coziness and that welcoming vibe, basically, would then just encourage people to explore and encourage people to want to interact and to find where the start of that puzzle cascade is. I think that was our kind of main core idea of just make it not so simple it's insulting, because there are people who obviously haven't solved the puzzle straight away. But to definitely make it so that it doesn't feel like we're against the player.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think that with regards to the level of the puzzle design in Shindig as well, like I say, we had the Act 1 and Act 2, and there's a certain point in which you get into Act 2. And if you've been observing things that are happening around the world, if you've been kind of paying attention, the pace increases and your aha moments start coming sort of thick and fast.
Yeah, more regularly.
And that's all just down to having this very leisurely, gentle kind of design to point players towards these 4 objectives that they have to complete.
And the general idea of like building this game around kindness and it's a very wholesome game. Was that something that you wanted like from like day one when you came up with the design?
Yeah, absolutely
Yeah.
was. So we were walking through the woods just towards the end of our Nintendo time period, where we were just about to move out of Germany, and we were discussing about how we were talking about sense of place in games, and how feeling like you can relax in a place is really important, and games can give you that. You can have a game which is just a place to go hang out and feel calm and relaxed.
And how, like, the classic adventure games, which were always, I was really into them when I was younger, and you were sort of less so. But the thing that we both enjoyed about them was just sort of hanging out in that
Yeah.
area and getting the ambience of it. So we had noticed that in classic adventure games, basically, and in all video games, really, a lot of the time you have to trick people or steal things from them or make their day worse to progress. And in very simple terms, we wanted to just avoid that like the plague. We wanted it to be a situation where you get to be nice to people in order to proceed, and have the choice architecture of the game basically not allow you to be a douchebag, not allow you
Yeah.
to just steal things from people's houses and stuff.
One of the other things that we were considering at the time as well is that a lot of games, because you can take your time and because you can invest your time in different ways, you get really attached to certain characters.
Yeah.
And then after a while, particularly in games which have a darker tone, or maybe they have quite a lot of conflict in them, you do start to think like, oh, I really like that character. I hope they don't die.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we really wanted that to be, we wanted Shindig to be a million miles away from that.
Yeah, because for us, a really important thing about, if this was going to be the only game we get to make, we want to make a statement with it, basically. We want to say the mental health matters and have that kind of thing be discussed openly by the characters. In order to destigmatize that discussion, we wanted to have a character creator so that people of color can have themselves in the game, because damn it, they're people too. Everybody,
all kinds of people.
everybody is welcome. You don't just want it to be a white cis male kind of representation of who is welcome in the game.
Absolutely not.
Though they're welcome too.
Yeah, of course.
And of course, we wanted to have the closed captions, and we wanted to have the hangouts where we discuss these deeper topics. But it's all centered around this idea of inclusivity, of kindness, and that being the sort of driving kind of North Star of what Shindig is as a game.
Yeah, it was that from day one, essentially.
Yeah, and I've had talks with other adventure game developers about like the almost like the psychopathic tendencies of adventure game heroes, and how they just I need to get in. Let me start a fire and burn this place down and try to get through this door.
Absolutely. Like in Shindig, we made a big point of consent being one of the themes. So there's a character who will give you a hug, but only if you're cool with that. He will ask you if you want a hug, basically. And you can pet the dog, that kind of thing. But the dog will prefer you to ask permission first. If you steal something from their house, the character actually just gives it to you. You don't steal things from people. There's this idea of like, oh, you can take that, Hey, why don't you take that with you? Which is just really important to us, so that your character, such as they are a character, because they're your sort of self-insertion avatar, is not able to be unkind, because there's plenty of representation of that in video games, and it's kind of refreshing to be able to create something that is the opposite of that.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I guess while I'm trying to think of any other questions, anything that we didn't discuss about Shindig that either of you want to bring up?
Feel like
I think I'd like to talk a little bit about the process of making sound for the game, if that's all right,
Sure.
because for me that was a really, really important part of the actual creation of the title. Because, like I said, we had this idea of creating a specific ambience that the player gets to step into, and for a lot of the kind of the sensory side of things, sound is really underestimated. The importance of sound is so great, that I think that it's important to understand that you can do it fairly easily yourself as an indie dev.
that's true.
I
Yeah.
say fairly easily because it is very time consuming, but the thing that we're recording this on is the device that we use to record all of the sounds of Shindig. So the bird song was recorded with this little handheld recorder, the sound of the waves,
Every single line of dialogue.
every single line of dialogue in a wardrobe with like a blanket stapled to the walls of the wardrobe to dampen the sound as best we could. And you know, it is possible to make some really high quality sound effects just by walking around your house with even your mobile phone, but definitely a little handheld recorder if you can get one. And
Yeah, we like to say about how the sound effects are all locally sourced. They are objects in our house or the birds in our garden.
yeah.
Even the waves are our local beach.
And as you know, as an indie dev learning to do the sound effects and the soundtrack completely from scratch, you know, there was a lot of tears of frustration at points because that learning process, the curve is so steep. So just to recommend to other indie devs that if you're doing music, I highly recommend Reaper. It is a fantastic program to use for that. And it allows you to do for a very, very low price what other digital audio workstations only allow, like the really high level.
Yeah. And it also has incredibly good support online.
Yeah, really good support. If you want to know how to do something, you can look it up, and Reaper have probably themselves made a video for it, basically. Or you can find, there's a guy called Kenny Joya, I think, who does amazing walkthroughs of how to do certain things from the sound side. Because the entire soundtrack of Shindig was composed by me on my ukulele and like recorded into my phone and then transferred into MIDI eventually in Reaper using completely free instruments from Spitfire Labs, which are super high quality, and you can just use them in all of your projects, you know, rights free, as it were. It's completely free to use, and they're super instruments. They really are. And I think that as an indie dev, if you have an interest in doing the sound side yourself, Shindig is an example of what you can do with free or very, very cheap software that can give you really professional quality results.
Yeah. I mean, and that's something that's so important to Shindig, and I think important to indies in general, is that access to tools, which is unprecedented these days. You know, in the time period before we went to Nintendo, I think there was no Unity, there was hardly any game maker, and these things have really democratized game creation.
Yeah.
And that's a great thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Definitely.
you know, you actually can, with a little handheld recorder, do a fully voiced indie game in your wardrobe if the mood should take you.
All right, so here's one question I'm sure people watching want to know: the photorealistic cat that's in the game, is that your cat that
It
made
is,
it?
yes. It is.
In fact, both cats in the game are our cats.
Yeah.
So
no one appears in cartoon form
Yeah.
for the entire game.
the real life Cosmos has been sitting next to Faye through this entire
Has been completely terrorizing.
conversation.
But the tabby, the brown tabby that you saw is Astrid. She is our cat, and she is a very grumpy girl. But they have very similar personalities to how they appear in the game.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things we haven't really mentioned is that like the characters of Shindig are just characters that we've had for literally years, just talking to each other in their voices to make each other laugh and making jokes. Or, you know, when Astrid decides she doesn't want the food today, then we would sort of make that joke in her voice, as it were.
Yeah, it's very much our love language, isn't it? Yeah. Giving voices to people and things.
So Astrid is a lot like that in real life. Though the things she says when she's sleep talking, if anyone's spotted those, they're the things I said while sleep talking.
Yes, those are all those are all noted down things that Faye has said while sleep talking.
All right. But I think with that, we can wrap things up. I know we said about an hour and a half, and we've certainly been chatting for quite a bit. I know it is definitely way past both of you to probably get some sleep. Absolutely. So my final quick, just like general logistics question. So Shindig is out now on PC. Is it coming to any other platforms?
Okay, so right now Shindig is just available on Windows PC via Steam and Itch. In the future, we'll be considering Linux and Mac versions, perhaps even some console ports, but it's a matter of logistics. And right now, this is the springboard, and hopefully we can start bringing it to other formats. Possibly mobile as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'd really like to localize the game. Right now, it's only available in English. It would be really cool if we could bring it to other languages. But as we said, right now, it's our first game. It's our first launch, and we've got to start somewhere and then build from that. So, fingers crossed.
All right. So, I guess my final question for both of you is, do you have anything you'd like to say to fans? Anything to wrap up with discussing Shindig? You know, the floor is yours.
It's so strange to have the concept of fans.
Yeah. First off, if you're listening to this now and you've played Shindig, or you've played it on a stream, or you've written a Steam review or something, we are eternally grateful. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. It means the world when people play your game. It means the world when people like your game and say that, because a lot of people keep their thoughts inside. And, you can put something out into the world and not really be sure of how it's received. So it's lovely to hear people's thoughts and insights. And especially when people, tell us, I really enjoyed this about it or that about it. And I'd love to see this from you guys next, because it's just really encouraging to know that people are really rooting for you.
Yeah, so thank you very much to the indie game community.
If you haven't played Shindig yet, and your interest has been piqued, it's super cheap. It's like £5.79. It's like less than $10. There's a soundtrack bundle and everything. And it's one of those games that I think on the outside, you don't really know what to expect. But something that a lot of people have said now, like several times, is that there's a lot more under the surface than you might initially think. And I think that
Shindig melts cold and simple hearts is another thing we hear a lot. So if you feel like you're suffering from a little of that, maybe give it a go.
A little bit cynical in there, maybe give it a go. It's a very short game, and we designed it to respect our players' time and to be something that parents could play with their kids, or won't take too long to play after their kids have gone to bed, maybe. And I think that a lot of people have said, what they wanted to see is a happy game, and that's exactly what they got. So if you want to see a happy game, please give Shindig a go.
All right. So I think with that, we will say goodnight here. So Fay and Marty, it's been a pleasure hanging out with the two of you. If you have any social media you would like to promote or where people can find you, go right ahead.
Sure.
Okay, so Imaginary Friends Games is at GamesFriendo on Twitter. You can also go to www.imaginaryfriendsgames.com.
Yep. And we have all of our social stuff linked from there. On Instagram, we're Imaginary Friends VG, because Imaginary Friends Games was far too long a handle. And you can find our trailers and things like that on YouTube. We have a channel there if you want to get a taste of the idea of it. But the best place, I think, to follow us is on Twitter, because that's where we're most active and we really like to talk to people on there. So, yeah.
All right. So, with that said, we will wrap things up for this cast. So, thanks again for coming on, and best of luck with whatever your next project may be.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yep, not a problem. So for those of you watching us, thank you for tuning in. Be sure to do all the liking and subscribing social media wise. If you want to check out Shindig, there'll be links to it in the description down below. And if you are a developer working on an upcoming game or want to just talk game design with me, we're always looking for guests. So feel free to reach out. Check out my latest books on design. They'll be linked down below as well. And come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where is in the art and science of games. Until next time, take care.